Today we are just over a month and a half into Phase 2 of Wrath Classic and Ulduar. The dust has very much settled and raiders of all levels have given the new content a good go, so I thought why not do a little update on the state of DPS for Wrath Classic across the board. Has the reality of a buffed Ulduar with buffed item levels met expectations when it comes to which DPS will be topping the meters? So I did a video similar to this for Phase 1 of Wrath Classic, which looked at the state of how DPS were expected to do pre-launch as opposed towards the end of the phase, and there were a few standout differences, notably that Unholy DK was completely busted with their ability to snapshot major cooldowns. I'll be including all DPS on a tier list kind of format for two reasons. Firstly, to compare to Phase 1 and see how things have changed, as well as to provide some kind of visual reference for where we started and where we will end up. I'll put them in order too, so top of each tier will be on the left and bottom on the right. For this I'll be using data from Warcraft logs so we can see the full range of the bottom end of performance to those right at the top, and I'll be throwing in some comments along the way and shedding some light on why classes are where they are. We've also had some minor class changes unexpectedly thrown into the mix for Ulduar II, so let's see how things are going. Are warriors finally starting to scale? Is Unholy still the king? And have any surprise results happened? Let's see how DPS is shaping up in Phase 2 of Wrath Classic. Before we go on, I want to do a quick shout out to today's sponsor, HelloFresh. If you find your wallet is taking a hit and your bills are going up, you don't need to economize on your healthy food choices. HelloFresh is 70% cheaper than eating out and 25% less than ordering takeout. It can even beat some of your local stores too. This month's offer has a huge discount of 60% on your first order on top of free shipping, so there's never been a better time to give it a try. If you have some kind of dietary requirements or want to pivot into eating new or different foods, HelloFresh has tons of options. For example, if you wanted to eat more protein, just check for the Protein Smart tag on the menu to find recipes featuring 30 grams or more of protein. You'll also get a full list of what's included in the pack, the allergen information, breakdown of nutritional values, and so on. What I like is these meals include the exact amounts of what you need, instructions, and no excess. It's learning how to cook food and staying on track with your goals. So why not give HelloFresh a go today? Use my link or go to hellofresh.com and use the code POGWillE MAR60 for 60% off plus free shipping. Once you click the link, my description will live update to count the purchases too. Many thanks to HelloFresh for the sponsor today. Let's get back to WoW. So for reference, here's how Warcraft logs are looked at the end of Phase 1, and just so you know what you're looking at here, the line on the left for each spec is the bottom 25% of performers. The bar to its right represents the 25 to 75% mark, with the middle of that being the median, and the dot on the far right is the maximum DPS achieved. Some specs will have much higher variance than others. There's reasons for that, and I'll talk about that when we get there. I'll also say for Ulduar that casters in general are a little bit overrepresented due to the mechanics of two of the boss fights. Hodia takes 50% extra magic damage from a debuff, on top of casters gaining a 135% crit modifier, and on General Vezax, casters get 100% bonus damage and 100% reduced cast speed from standing in the Shadow Crash debuff. Melee on the other hand in this raid get, well, no special treatment when it comes to specific boss fights. I'll go over which classes benefit the most from these special mechanics too when it's relevant. There's one or two in particular which stand out a pretty huge amount. Let's make a start with a plate DPS. Death Knights are in a fantastic spot in Phase 2 as a DPS overall. Okay, well, apart from Blood, I guess I'll give it a mention fast, it's still not really a thing. If you want to try it, be my guest, but make sure you go and tick the box on details to always show yourself on the damage meters, otherwise you might forget you're there. Unholy got targeted nerfs at the end of Phase 1. It's the first spec to ever have been nerfed in Classic 2. Essentially, Blizzard were concerned that if it's as far ahead as it was in Phase 1, it's just going to be crushing even harder once they gain access to better gear, so they implemented the following changes, which in short say your Summon Gargoyle's haste will now match the DKs at all times, instead of inheriting whatever value it was when it was summoned. This was a sizable nerf, chopping a few hundred DPS off the Unholy DK's incredible burst. However, more recently, Unholy, and well, DKs in general I suppose, but especially Unholy, now benefit from Army of the Dead resetting on encounter end. This means DKs and Unholy will have access to this cooldown every single fight, instead of every other pull or whatever it may have been depending on the boss length and your raid speed. This pushes them back up the meters once again, and whilst for me they were the clear best overall in Phase 1, in Phase 2 so far they're still absolutely an S tier, but they just need to move down the category a little. Frost Death Knights have been powering up the meters this phase with tons more armor pen gear being available, buffed item level weapons, and many more cleave heavy fights. They're starting to make big improvements, moving up from midway through A tier to towards the bottom of S for me, and as more armor pen becomes available they should continue to climb. The main problem on the DK is making a choice on which spec you want to play, as their stat priority and some key pieces of gear are quite different. I'd say arguably DK is overall in a better place than it was in Phase 1, since the two specializations are much closer together now. Either way, the hero class keeps doing hero class things. You really can't go wrong on a DK. Next, the Retribution Paladin. Well, if Unholy was the first spec to ever get nerfed in WoW Classic, Ret was the first to ever get buffed, and it needed it. Ret was kept somewhat afloat in Naxxramas due to the whole place being packed with undead, which allowed their exorcism to crit and Holy Wrath to stun. Ulduar is a little scarce on undead, or demons for that matter, and Ret was expected to naturally drop down the meters in this tier, and they couldn't exactly have dropped much further looking at where they were in Phase 1. Here's the buffs that Blizzard gave them. What this means in short is the damage over time effects from Seal of Vengeance or Corruption can now be applied by Divine Storm or Crusader Strike. This makes your target swapping and getting set up on your main target quite a bit faster, as well as a new glyph that makes Hand of Reckoning do damage but no longer taunt. In practice, this all translates to around a 10% DPS increase, more or less for macroing Hand of Reckoning into your whole kit. And looking on the meters here, it's definitely an improvement. Ret is still not there to top the meters by any stretch of the imagination, but I feel okay moving them up from midway through C tier to the bottom of B. And I'll always say it, but Paladin utility is OP whatever damage or healing they are doing. Next, Warrior. Is the nightmare finally over? Will it be a return to the glory days of Classic of seeing nothing but brown across your meters? Yeah, not quite yet, no. Arms first. Have a rogue play combat. That's kind of all I want to say for Arms. The spec was not looking hot in Nax, and it sure ain't in Ulduar either. The only reason Arms isn't with the meme specs is because of the 4% physical debuff it brings. Of course, the only other spec that can do that is the Combat Rogue, and I think one Fury and one Combat will beat out one Arms and one Assassination most of the time. As for Fury, you know what? They are starting to scale. If you look at some of the top passes for bosses with heavy, consistent cleave, Fury is up there. Bosses such as your XT or Kolaghan. Fury just kinda needs more than one thing to hit all of the time. On pure single target, not very great still, but the inevitable is starting to happen. The Warrior Fury scaling ball is now in motion. Oh, also commanding shout on bosses that can just one-tap you with mechanical overlaps such as Freya or Algalon is really useful, so Fury gets bumped up to midway through B. Onto the male classes, let's begin with Hunter. You know, one of the things I was hoping for in Ulduar was better boss hitboxes. If you didn't know, survival hunters always want to dip into melee to drop an explosive trap over casting Black Arrow because they share a cooldown. Explosive trap does more damage and has a greater chance to proc lock and load, and you can glyph it so it crits. During Phase 1, there were a number of bosses where the hitboxes were just absolutely terrible. Your trap would be inside the boss's red circle and it would still not go off, and if you miss your trap, your DPS absolutely just disappears. And in Ulduar, well, hitboxes are arguably even worse, unfortunately. There's bosses that move around a lot, or bosses where you don't want to really go into melee at all. It just feels more annoying to pull off than it already was. All the same, if we look at Warcraft logs, survival has notably jumped up a few spots from where it was in Phase 1, so it's definitely staying in the A tier for me, though moving down a bit as I think other specs have improved a bit more. As for Marksman, again I was kind of expecting to see some life for this spec in Phase 2, and this hasn't been the case. Unlike Survival, Marksman really cares about having a good weapon, and with 252 weapons tons and tons more armor penetration in the raid, I thought once people start getting their Skyforge crossbows, marksman will come online. Either it's just a case of not enough top end players have tried it, or survival is just clearly this far ahead, but marksman seems to be lagging behind at this point and remains a low end B spec. Shaman next. First up, the class has seen a large buff across the board as their fire elemental totem now resets on encounter end. If they had this in phase 1, I probably would have put at least enhancement in S tier, as phase 1 had so many short boss fights. Moving into phase 2, both specs I think are in a good spot. Enhancement is still playing the more spell focused variant of the specialization, using flame tongue weapon instead of wind fury on their weapons, and now with fire elemental resetting, strong cleave, good single target, the totem utility, an interrupt and even off heals from maelstrom weapon, enhance continues to be a specialization that would be a good addition to pretty much any raid team. The only problem could be the very fast paced rotation, which may not be for everyone, so for phase 2, enhance stays in A tier for me. As for elemental, I think it's actually better than people give it credit for, and it's in a weird spot where it's seen as a not very good spec, so none of the best players are picking it up and taking the specialization to the limits that it's capable of, and this kind of reflects the overall performance on Warcraft logs too. I'm gonna say it again, fire elemental resetting is a big deal for Shaman DPS, and also Shaman have this little ability called heroism or bloodlust, and you want one Shaman in every single group you make without exception. That's quite a selling point. Elemental moves up a little bit in B for me. I think it could even be on the lower side of A, but there's not quite enough data to support it. Right then, on to the people who enjoy wearing leather. Rogues first. Sub remains with the memes, no changes there. Combat sees a small bump up in the A tier. Higher item level weapons have gone a long way to improve an already good specialization. On top of this, the fights in Ulduar have a lot more cleave and adds where rogues can get huge benefits from blade flurry. They have way better target switching than assassination and are set to improve more as more armor penetration becomes available on gear. As for assassination, it was just behind Unholy in phase 1 for me, and overall the second best DPS. It's fallen down just a little bit, but is still an easy S tier for me. It's very straightforward to play and offers some of the best single target damage in the game. I can see rogues looking this kind of state for the remainder of Wrath, by the way. Combat should overtake assassination eventually, but it's going to have to be pretty amazing to do so. Druid. Did you know back in Ulduar in 2009, Feral was considered a top DPS specialization? I mean, here's Insidia's world first Algalon. Look who's at the top of that meter. Today though, paints quite a different picture. Final patch class balance is treating some better than others, and Feral has always been a very high effort class to min-max DPS. This expansion's no different, but the Feral enjoyers are lower down on the meters all the same. And no, in case you're wondering, this data doesn't include druids that are tanking. Warcraft logs separates them out based on the amount of damage taken during an instance. This goes for both off tanking and main tanking, as shown here by Warden and Guardian druid specs. It just seems as though this may not be the expansion it was expected to be for cats if they aren't making progress on the meters this far into Ulduar. I put them into C here, down from B. This might be a bit much, but that's kind of what the data's showing. Balance has also seen a bit of a drop off compared to phase 1, and I put them at the top of B. I have a feeling as though in actual raid your balance is going to be showing better than this a lot of the time because of Starfall. Warcraft logs filters out damage which is considered not relevant for the boss, such as the Stone Shard adds on Collargarn after you kill one of his arms, or the cleave damage on Iron Council. I think Boomy's heavily benefited from faster fights during phase 1 and fights where its huge opener was fully accounted for on fights with adds. I think there's less of this now, so I've moved them down a little. Finally, let's touch some cloth. Shadow Priest has moved up in the DPS rankings on Warcraft logs, but I'm keeping it exactly where it was near the top of B. Shadow is one of two specializations which I think is a bit overrepresented due to Hodir and Vezax, where it can realistically top DPS with a solid pull. On more or less any of the fights with a raid of players of equal skill, this isn't very likely to happen. Still, they remain really solid. They are by far the best and safest option for soaking big bangs on Algalon, and they contribute a great bit of utility to the raid too. You could put a Shadow Priest in almost any raid and it's a good addition. The Mage is next, and it's kind of in a similar spot to DK and Rogue. There are two specs to play here, and both of them are doing great. Arcane is still towards the bottom of A for me. It was expected to be the go-to mage specialization for the first half of Wrath, roughly speaking. However, Ulduar bringing buffs to item level has meant that fire is starting to ramp up faster than expected. Arcane also benefits hugely from shorter fights too, and during progression, and indeed reclears on Ulduar, there aren't a huge amount of short enough fights for it to really shine. Fire, however, has come a long way from being not bad in phase 1 to now I'd say being towards the top of A tier instead. However, I'm gonna say I think this is the most overrepresented DPS spec in the game because of how disproportionately hard fire scales with bonus spell damage fights. If you look at the all percentiles page for Warcraft logs, fire has the most amount of variance between the top end and the bottom end for DPSs. The top end passes in the world for Hodia at the moment are just above 35,000, and there's even a Frost Firebolt spec that's being used due to being able to pick up extra crit modifiers in the Frost tree. To put into perspective how much 35k is already, the world first 2009 pre-nerf 2-minute Hodia kill by Insidia used some creative game mechanics, where they pulled trash over from Freya's room and had mages spell steal 10 stacks of Pollinate. This gave them 250% bonus damage for the entire fight. You can't spell steal this buff anymore for rather obvious reasons, and if you look at their video kill here, I know it's kinda scuffed, but their top mage is somewhere around 38k DPS. Compare this to today, if we give it a few more resets, people will be beating what needed a 250% damage buff to do before. The point is, fire is really good on the bonus caster fights and has very high variance due to needing crit for ignite to get going. That's why if you look at 95 percentile, fire is nearly always going to be near the top, but for me, I'm going to be a bit more conservative and keep it in the A tier for the time being. Finally, the Warlock. Kinda like phase 1, this class is spoiled for choice, with an argument to be made for playing all 3 specializations being totally valid. The odd one out for me is Destruction, and I put it in C tier here, and that doesn't really reflect the damage that it can do, it's just, well, the other 2 specs exist, and Destruction is a utility pick. There are fights in Ulduar which are not DPS checks, even on hard mode, which can hugely benefit from somebody going Destruction. On Freya you can Shadow Fury the small adds after they're knocked away, and on Mimron it helps control the bots. On top of that, your Imp's Blood Pact is another extra buffer of health to help people live damage overlaps. Destruction isn't bad, but you wouldn't really play it, aside from the utility, most of the time. Demonology continues to do really well. I think it's still just about in S. As somebody who mains the spec, what happens as demo is a new raid comes out, you get prioritized on gear because Demonic Pact benefits the whole raid, meaning your DPS shoots up at the start of a new tier and you look really good. Then in the following weeks, the other people start getting gear too and they start catching up and eventually they will overtake you. I think this is going to happen every tier, by the way. Still, the spec is super good to play. It's great AoE, good execute, amazing on overall damage, and as an added benefit, it's probably the most hard to die on spec in the game. For real, on my Hunter, I actually have to pay attention to mechanic. Demonology just takes 25% less damage by existing and has a big health pool. It's a big benefit which you don't really realize is there until you play something that's more squishy. Finally, Affliction. I've saved the best for last? Yeah, I have. This spec is just straight up busted in Ulduar. It's the best in the game and it's just not even close. Huge damage at all points throughout the fight, best execute phase in the game. Affliction can even drop Infernals to benefit from heroism during execute as an extra added bonus, even though Infernal doesn't reset when encounters end. Come on Blizzard, sort it out. Warlocks need the help. This shouldn't even be Affliction's final form either. They should continue to scale up as we progress onwards. Locks are just taking straight wins in this expansion so far, and I don't expect that to change anytime soon. The only problem, if there was one, is caster loot is really contested. You might technically be playing the best DPS class, but 10 other people want the same items that you do. It's kind of like the vanilla warrior experience all over again, and that's how I think things are looking in Ulduar about a month and a half in. I think that Fire Mage and Fury Warrior stonks are going to keep going up as they get more gear, and maybe things could be moved around a little bit within each tier where I put them. Other than that, I'm pretty happy where everything is. All in all, if you think about it, Warlock, Mage, DK and Rogue each have 2 DPS specializations to play, which are pretty close to one another in performance. They all play differently, bring different benefits to the raid, and are just straight up good additions. You couldn't really say this about prior expansions, and I'd say I'm pretty happy with how class balance is. in Ulduar? Would you make any big changes to this list? Think anything is just way out of place? And are you happy with how your main has turned out so far in this expansion and in this tier? Let me know below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in. I'll see you all in the next one very soon.